Good afternoon. This is Karen Grogan, and I'm your host this afternoon for the Poultry Podcast Show. We want to welcome you to this episode. We have a very exciting guest for today. Dr. Joe Giambrone is a professor emeritus in Auburn University's Department of Poultry Science, with a joint appointment over in the College of Veterinary Medicine also. Joe has a over 40-year career in research in virology, immunology, and epidemiology of poultry diseases. He has serviced really the global poultry industry with a lot of things that we deal with on a daily basis. So we have invited Joe today to talk about a variety of subjects. So welcome, Joe. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. You surviving the summer heat here in the South?
It's difficult, but I've been going 45 years with it, so I've gotten used to it.
Right. And where are you originally from, Joe? Because I don't think it's Alabama.
Okay, I grew up the outskirts of Philadelphia.
Okay, that's what I thought. And then where did you do all of your training? What's your background? Like, when you're talking to students, where have you done all of your degrees?
Well, I went to the University of Delaware to be a marine biologist, and I found out that it was oceanography. So I took a course in poultry health from this fella, and he was a veterinarian, graduated from the University of Georgia, and I really enjoyed it. That was my junior year. And then my senior year, I took another course from him in virology. And then he said, "Did you want to go on? You want to go on for a master's?" I said, "Yeah, wonderful." So one of the first the first project I had was looking at coronaviruses in chickens, infectious bronchitis virus, looking at developing a vaccine against an antigenic variant, which was at the first time that it had been done. And then the second part, that was with 𝗹𝗶𝗹𝗹. Then I went to that's right. Then I went with Jack Rosenberger.
And what just for the conversation, what antigenic variant was that you were working on then?
It was called JMK, and it had to do with it came from 𝗹𝗵𝗿, and the individual's name was 𝗪𝗵𝗁, who was with Stirwin. And
this is going to be a poultry medicine history lecture.
Yeah, he gave us isolation units to do this development of this vaccine. And it was with he and Jack Rosenberger and Bob Eckroat. So I learned a lot. So then the next project was finishing up, was going to Chesapeake Bay to isolate viruses from hunter-killed birds in the Chesapeake Bay. And we really enjoyed doing that. We isolated a number of viruses that didn't cause any disease in birds, but I found out that years later that these viruses can then spill over and cause disease in poultry. And then I guess that's why they were really interested in doing it. It wasn't until about 15, 20 years ago until there was outbreaks in 𝗹𝗪𝗹, which over the years, now we have them all over the world. But when I went after I got my master's, he said, "Why don't you go to the University of Georgia in this College of Veterinary Medicine Poultry Disease Research Center?" I said, "Oh, yeah." So I was invited there by 𝗪𝗶𝗹𝗹, who was involved in 𝗪𝗪𝗁 disease vaccination. So we started doing that work. I really enjoyed it. While we were doing the work, the chickens broke with infectious bursal disease virus. And so we found out that the ones that were vaccinated all end up having 𝗪𝗪𝗁 disease. The ones because they had bursal disease. The ones that didn't have bursal disease, they ended up being immune. So that started the whole thing with immune suppression. So I published a number of articles there on the effect of infectious bursal disease virus on Newcastle disease, bronchitis, coccidiosis, 𝗪𝗪𝗁 disease. And so then there was a job open in Auburn, and I actually didn't know where it was. So they said,
sure they don't hold that against you now.
Yeah, no. So I went over there, and people were really friendly to me. And they said, "Well, we need someone to teach poultry diseases in the College of Veterinary Medicine, but we also want you to do research and outreach." And it was good because the person I had replaced was just a teacher. So they were able then to give me funds to do to have the laboratory. They gave me funds to develop a SPF house and another one to do the research. And so it really went well for me. Years later, I got back into the coronaviruses with bronchitis. I did a sabbatical in Melbourne, there in the College of Veterinary Medicine.
Oh,
yes, and they had a.
Did you work with like 𝗪𝗵𝗵𝗶?
Yes, I did. He invited me over there. It was really, really interesting.
He was a character.
He was, unfortunately passed
He's a great guy.
ago,
I know.
He was. They had a virus there that caused nephrosis, and yes, and so they were interested, and it wasn't not controlled by the vaccine. So basically, we went there and did the first sequencing of the spike protein gene from this virus, and I learned a lot. Actually, that's where I learned about molecular virology, and I really enjoyed it. Came back to Auburn, continued bursal disease, working with a lot of vaccine companies were helping me do this kind of work. They were giving me the money. We went with Select. We went with, I guess then it was Salisbury, and then it was Fort Dodge, and that's how it is.
Back when bursal disease vaccines were a commodity, like everybody had all these different bursal disease vaccines. Everybody wanted to prove theirs was the best.
Yeah, that was really good. And I guess with Select, they were really the ones that came out with actually they took what was the Lukert strain. And that Lukert strain then became really the first vaccine that didn't cause disease, because the other ones that are out there they were pretty virulent. So we worked with that. Also, they were really good with developing tremendous titer to HVT. And so using that amount that they were good at, they were able to outcompete all the other pharmaceutical companies because they were making it such high titers. But anyway, so I did continue with bursal disease, working with Kalen Cookson and a lot of other good people. And then I did some more bronchitis, but what really I moved into was reoviruses. And the reoviruses were at that time were causing, everybody knew about Jack Rosenberg and others about viral arthritis, but we found out that these were also causing an enteric disease. And so we did a lot of work there with little vaccines, and we found out that vaccinating the pullets, just like we did with bursal disease, with 2 live and killed, the chickens would then hatch out with maternal immunity, and that would produce some good immunity. But years later, at the University of Georgia, with a number of other people, found out that there are antigenic variants, and so they had to develop a whole new amounts of vaccines. And the work that was there, done by the people at the University of Georgia, still is. They're at the forefront of looking at these variant viruses. And so then I started working with influenza, and influenza virus. How we got involved in that is that the virus then was, it hadn't been around in the U.S. for a long time. It was mainly other countries. It had all of a sudden started causing some outbreaks. And so basically I got money to do more of these surveillance. And so we were going to really hunter-killed, really they were where these birds were then, I can't really think of the word, but anyway, we were swabbing the cloaca and the oral and cloacal for these viruses, and then isolating them and characterizing them back there. And the wildlife refuges, that's what I couldn't think about.
Now, is that in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Game, or how were you accessing hunter harvested birds?
Okay. Well, first off, we got a grant where the University of Georgia and I guess it was a $5 million grant, and universities all across the U.S. And I was involved in surveillance. Individuals in Georgia were doing other things. So that gave us the money to do the work. Now, we had to get with these USDA people to go to, not USDA, but the wildlife people, when we were at these hunter-killed areas, they would allow us to do the swabs of the birds which had already been killed. And so then we isolated a number of viruses, but luckily we never had any H5s, and they were not, or H7s, they're not pathogenic. But what it showed us was that the viruses were prevalent in wild free-flying birds. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing that it's spilled over again into poultry, and it's become a worldwide phenomena as far as the problem with influenza, as I see it now, it's actually gone through the summertime, where we normally think spring is the end. That was one thing. The other thing we saw outbreaks in wild free-flying birds, which had not seen that before.
So what do you think has changed in terms of, do you think it's waterfowl movements? Do you think that it's the virus itself? Do you think, what is your sort of working knowledge in terms of these influenza viruses? Like, why are we seeing like buzzard die-offs? Like that doesn't typically happen in influenza outbreaks.
Yeah, well, this virus, Swain and others have shown that it's the Eurasian virus that we saw in 2016, which caused the problems. But the fact that it's gone through in warm weather and it's gone to these others, I suspect that Swain and others will probably have to go and do some sequencing of the H's and N's. That tail end of the H's where you have a run of basic amino acids or other things, that something about that virus has changed to allow it to go on longer. And I don't know that if it's changed in the genetics of the bird. I mean, that's possible. I think obviously the virus has changed so that it's these wild free-flying birds normally get the virus just in the enteric tract, and they shed it that way, and they don't get the virus causing respiratory disease and spreading of viremic. But now it seems to do that. And, that work will have to do a lot of sequencing. And then people at Georgia and other places that have BL3 labs will be able then to go in and infect birds, which, even though I'm retired now, but before that, we didn't have a BL3 anyway. So, but that work's going to have to be done. They're going to have to take that virus. There are probably multiple viruses out there, infect the birds, do sequencing, re-isolate the virus, complete Koch's postulate, then compare it to the 2016 virus, the sequence, and see how it's in fact different.
Right. So in terms of, sort of on the global front, we see influenza endemic in many countries. And I know you've done surveillance in those countries where it's endemic. And there's, arguments on control strategies. And I know that, discussions are ongoing in the US and then within OIE. And there's even changes within the definition of what's considered poultry. Like we have backyard fox are considered non-poultry now in terms of definitions for OIE. So, how, let's say if these viruses do become endemic, how do you suggest to these areas, Europe, United States, Canada, large production areas, how do we control this?
Well, I think what we're seeing now, especially in Europe and a lot of other countries, is they're vaccinating the free-range birds, because those are going to have a mixture of the wild free-flying birds with those birds that are free-range, which can then go back. So a lot of veterinarians and other people are upset with the culling, because we've culled out so many birds with influenza. And a number of veterinarians, not only in the US, but around the world, are saying that we're going to need to start vaccinating. And probably there are 4 or 5 really good vaccines, recombinant vaccines, that have come out now that basically they've been cloned into HVT. They've got some cloned into pox. They've got some cloned into Newcastle. And I think what the US is going to do is a wait and see to these other countries like China and Russia and Europe to see how they vaccinate and see how they control it. The one reason we don't vaccinate in the US is because of embargo. Now, the World Animal, I guess the OIE doesn't exist anymore. It's now the World Health and Animals. But they, in the past, saying that you can compartmentalize it so that if there was an outbreak in California, other countries shouldn't embargo, birds from the southeast. But there are countries that don't subscribe to that. They're just going to do whatever they're going to do, and they'll still embargo the whole country. And the other problem is that in the U.S. we have the most amount of basic breeders, and we're sending chicks and eggs around the world. And if those were embargoed, we'd have a really big problem. So I really think in the future that we're probably going to see some sort of vaccination of the birds that are out free range. Now, as far as large commercial layer farms that have 5 million birds, I don't see that ever being vaccinated. But I think it's going to have to be some give and take.
And in terms of like implementation, what size flocks are you talking about vaccinating? Like, Susie's 5 chickens in her backyard, or are you talking like people that have 100 plus?
I think these are commercial companies that have up to 10% of the birds are free range. So those
you're
are
talking
the ones
about
we're
poultry
looking at.
that would have access to the outdoors, like birds that are marketed under organic,
Yes,
things that are marketed
exactly.
under. So they would be commercial production, but things that have access to the outdoors.
Yeah, I think that's where we're going. But when that's going to happen, if we have 1 or 2 more of these years in a row where we're getting millions and millions of birds die and be culled, sooner or later we have to come out with a new answer.
And in terms of the products that you're discussing, I think there's discussion starting within the U.S. as well. What products do we have available, either that we could import? USDA regulations don't really allow. They're fairly strict. What could we get quickly?
Well, I mean, the commercial companies that are making vaccines, they also exist in this country. They're just not allowed to produce them. So it'd just be a maid of the government saying, okay, now you can produce those vaccines. And so what have been used for a long, long time in other countries, especially in the Middle East and China and Southeast Asia, is an inactivated vaccine, which is given to the chicks in a hatchery. That's been around for a long time. And that's mainly H9, because H9 has been causing respiratory disease in commercial chickens for 40 years. And but see, now they have an H7 and there's an H5. But I think what we're going to see is if they're going to be in recombinant for foulpox or HVT, more than likely they're going to be injected into the chicks, probably in the hatchery. It's not to say that they couldn't do the foulpox when the birds are pullets. Yeah, I mean, those are out. The biggest companies in the world now, I don't want to name names, but they in fact have them. 2 of the biggest companies in the world have the recombinant vaccines, either in foulpox or HVT, and so you don't have to worry about those spreading out any shedding birds shedding the virus.
And in terms of sort of conditional approval or regulatory control of that, what would you foresee in terms of USDA's regulations on that, since we don't have them currently approved in the US?
Yes. A long time ago, there's actually in turkeys, there was a killed vaccine, but that goes back 30 years before your time probably. But the problem with the vaccines, and Dr. Swain will say this, is that they don't totally stop replication. And so you've got that virus could continue to spread, even though they're not, gives you close to 100% protection against clinical disease, but not to virus shed. So I think they're probably going to do things like ring vaccination. Let's say you have an outbreak of 1 million birds or something on a broiler flock. Right now, it's 10 kilometers, anything within 10 kilometers right now is quarantined and tested, right? And that's how we try to compartmentalize it. Would we see in the future that those flocks within that 10 kilometer, would they then be allowed to vaccinate, and nothing outside of that? So I think that's what we're going to see. And the USDA, I think, is wait and see now and see what happens in Europe and these other countries. I think eventually they're going to be kicking and screaming into it, doing it. They're not going to want to do it, but eventually it's going to happen. And those basic breeders they're pretty locked down. So it's not like they're going to get the virus in there. So they still should be able, the basic breeders still should be able to, if there's outbreaks in that area, they should be able to export the eggs without a problem to companies around the world. And there's multiplier flocks all over the world too.
And in terms of the vaccine in other species, our colleagues in the turkey industry, the ducks have been heavily impacted in Pennsylvania, Indiana. Are those recombinant vaccines labeled for use are they labeled in just chickens, or are they?
I don't really know, but I don't think there would be a problem, because you're basically taking a part of the hemagglutinin and then inserting it into a virus. It shouldn't make any difference, really. They may have to alter dosages, some may, but I don't see that. Certainly they could do some safety and efficacy studies. If it's approved for chickens, then they would have to get it approved for these other species. I don't think that would be a problem.
Okay, excellent. And then what other, we always talk about that vaccination is a tool in our toolbox. What other things do we need to look at as an industry in terms of trying to mitigate these outbreaks of avian influenza like we've seen in 2022?
I think one thing that we're going to have to be really careful for is live bird markets, and not only live bird markets, but the show birds. We do a fairly good job of testing birds before they get to the live bird market and during the live bird market. And if there are any outbreaks before or after the birds are terminated, we don't allow birds in the live bird market to go back to the farms, which is a problem in foreign countries. And they're mixing multiple ages in foreign countries, which we actually don't allow that here. We don't allow multiple species in the live bird market, but it's still always a possibility that it could get there, maybe by infecting a person. Because the virus can stay in the hive. So a worker, we don't. In California, there's an awful lot of workers on those farms that are not supposed to have backyard birds, but there's always a possibility that they could, and they could get it in there. The other thing is that the show birds. I know in Alabama and Georgia, first off, we don't allow live animal markets, but we do have.
But we got flea markets and swap meets, and they just call them different things.
Yes,
we have them. They're just under a different name.
I know in Alabama, I'm sure Georgia's doing that too. They're in fact going out and testing these birds. And so just because you test it at that moment doesn't mean that it's kind of like COVID. They, maybe just didn't get it at the right time. So that is always going to be a problem as far as what I can tell, because there's going to be birds that get in and out of those show, whatever you want to call them, that have not been tested. And those individuals, obviously, that raise those birds should not have exposure to commercial flocks. But, our commercial farms, broilers are getting bigger and bigger, and there's so many that they have to actually bring in help. It used to be mom and pop on the broiler farms now, but if you've got so many that you have to hire workers that come in and help, that could be another problem where these workers that you're bringing in to do your broilers and could be, they could have a virus. So
definitely biosecurity is an important detail. Always paying attention. Always paying attention.
Yep. Biosecurity and surveillance, I think, are what we have. And then basically in the US, we've gone to ways to call them out incredibly fast. The ventilation shutdown is just unbelievable. But there are a lot of individuals say that that's not a really good thing to do. But you're calling those birds out to save the other birds, and so
it is for disease control purposes. I think that it's a different, you know, they have highly pathogenic avian influenza. Like you'll have 100% mortality if you leave it there, and then it will spread to the farms around them. So sometimes as veterinarians, we have to make decisions and choices for disease spread or disease control that, so I think there's a lot of science, and we have some more research that's coming out about that. And I think that as an industry, we all want to do the best that we can by, we want to raise birds and we want to get them, to market. But when you have an outbreak of a highly infectious viral disease, you have to make some decisions and choices. And sometimes supply chain doesn't allow you to get the tools that you might need to use a different euthanasia method. So there's definitely, I've spoken to a lot of colleagues that have been through, this latest outbreak, and that is hard. Like it is very difficult and emotionally taxing in terms of making those decisions. So we can all just support our fellow colleagues on that.
Well, the industry has the money for indemnification, but there's a lot of other countries where they cannot call the birds out because they can't afford it.
They can't. No. I think when we're talking high path avian influenza, that limits our, we want to get that under control. When we look at low path avian influenza, I think you have some other options. You can wait until the birds stop shedding. You can do what's called controlled marketing. We have low path viruses, but when we get to these high path versions, that's when we have to do a lot of extra things. And in the U.S., that's driven by what APHIS has to say, and not necessarily what we would decide. So if we want that indemnification, we have to go by what the federal government says.
Yeah, the problem with the low path H5N1, it has been shown to mutate on the same farm. So you've got it low path, and then 3 or 4 weeks later, it becomes high path. And that's one reason APHIS is saying you need to call the birds out.
As an industry, you were discussing that, maybe perception of some of these things and culling, is not the greatest sort of perception of our industry. So another aspect of that is, you'll see in popular press, you'll see things like, oh, it's because they raise animals the way that they have. We are portrayed in that the size of our industry is driving these viral things. What do you think about that in terms of, does our management, tie into any of this at all?
Well, I mean, the free range birds, the small flocks, the backyard flocks, they're just as susceptible. And those, because of the fact that it's bred by these free flying birds, I don't see the fact that we have 500,000 birds on a farm as opposed to someone else that has a few thousand. They're both susceptible. And those, in fact, it might be, in fact, that the birds, it's spilling over from the free flying birds into these small flocks and then into the larger flocks. You can look at it either way, but I don't think the fact that we have that many birds, actually, I think that we have these many birds into a small house, into a house, they're enclosed, we have a better way of controlling in and out. If they're outside, you don't have.
In theory, we control the in and out.
Yes.
I think there's more movement on and off of farms clearly than we know about sometimes. Well, I think we talked about influenza. We've talked about that. So I'd be curious to shift gears in your background in immunosuppression. I think that immunosuppression is still, playing a major role in much of, the U.S. for sure, and for surely the global industry. In terms of things that we can control, where do you seek, because you have been from the very beginning of controlling IBD and reoviruses. We know reoviruses can contribute to immunosuppression. You've researched 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗋. How do all of these things play together to give us the clinical immunosuppression picture?
Well, I mean, there are other non-respiratory diseases. We know mycotoxins. There are other things that can get into the feed that can also, it's just not the viruses. But going back to just the viruses, it's basically immunizing the hens to have the highest amount of titer, the most uniform titer for the longest amount of time to provide coverage for the chicks. And that's been the hallmark of bursal disease and reoviruses. In the last 10 years is when we started, in fact, vaccinating chickens for bursal disease broilers, because in the past they didn't want to do it because it was too expensive and there weren't really good vaccines. But now, as you know, that there are so many recombinants now. I mean, there's 4 or 5 recombinants out there that you've got bursal disease, you've got Newcastle, bronchitis, LT, all cloned into it like HVT or pox. So those are things now that you could do before, where basically we were just looking to immunize the hens. But now I think the problem with breaking or having problems with immunosuppressions are due to antigenic variants with bursal disease and reoviruses. They're breaking through the maternal immunity that the hens are getting. And so you've got one or two things. You either need to vaccinate the chicks or come up with whatever those viruses that are out there that are causing problems, and then have them inserted into the pullet farm and pullet vaccines to provide immunity. Either has to come on the back end or the front end. So, and if there's a breakdown in either way, and of course the vaccine companies like that because they're always having to come out with new vaccines. Yeah, exactly. So, and the companies out there are doing a really good job. You know, if you listen to the top people, you know, like the Jackwoods with bronchitis or bursal disease, they're always out there doing surveillance for antigenic variants. And the commercial companies like themselves, you know, with Callan Cookson and others are in concert with the university professors. Okay, if you're having immune suppression, even though your hens are vaccinated 3, 4, 5 times, and it's breaking through the immunity of the chicks, then you need to start isolating, identifying those viruses, do sequencing, and figure out what it is, and then that's going to have to be inserted either in the pullets or the broilers. But it's always catch up. It's like, you know, you got something for a year, and then unfortunately that you need something else.
Correct. We talk about this a lot in terms of, like, you know, you're waiting for the next shoe to drop, you know, the next variant to emerge, you know, whatever happens in terms of bronchitis or a new reovirus, you know, we're constantly doing surveillance for reovirus, and our friends in the turkey industry, I think, also struggle with reovirus now. Which is something, you know, 20 years ago, you know, we didn't really think it did. But now there's reoviruses really causing a lot of clinical illness in turkeys. So if you could give advice to someone who's just starting in the industry, what are some key things that helped you get to where you are today?
Do what I did and find a mentor. Either mentor within the same university, or some say without, you know, in another university, or maybe within the USDA. Follow what they're doing when you go to the AAA meetings or any more local ones like the SCAD meeting or others. Find out the research which is being done. The AAAP every year puts out like the top 10 diseases, and that usually comes from surveys that they send out to the veterinarians that work for the poultry companies. What is your big problem? Is it bronchitis? And if you're a young person, you have to go after the money. So and
right. If you're working on research, you got to write the grants.
Yes, and these are multidisciplinary. They're multi-institutionalized. If let's say you're at Auburn or some other place and you don't have an expert in that area, go to Georgia or some other place and get together and put in a grant, and
Right.
it may be something you might need an immunologist, a virologist, a pathologist, put them together and have the group that can compete, because they're very competitive, these grants. And so that's what I would look at. And when I first started in Alabama, I went to industry meetings in Alabama, but the whole Southeast. And I listened to what they were telling me were the problems. And the other thing is I had a close relationship with Fred Hare in the diagnostic lab. And I think that would be, we were lucky at Auburn, and we had something that they didn't have at Georgia. We, in fact, had the university, the poultry science, we had the College of Veterinary Medicine, and we had the diagnostic lab, all three within a half mile. And that really served us well, especially with Fred Hare. If I needed to have some pathology, he did the pathology, right? If I needed someone to isolate and identify the viruses, they're coming from the state lab. So you need to find out where you can get help. I mean, because you can't do it all yourself.
Building a network.
No question. It's extremely important.
Yes, you got to make all those connections.
Yeah, and it takes a certain person to be able to do that. Not everybody's a people person. You got to be out there and interact with other people, and really find one area and specialize in it. Because when I first came to Auburn, and a lot of professors do this, they jump all around trying to find something.
You have to find your specialty.
Yeah, find your specialty, but things will change. I started with bursal disease, and within the 42 years, I have gone through about 5 different viruses, because it's the virus of the day. They change.
And you're responding to industry needs. Like you are, what's out there and needs to be looked at. Your research was reflecting that.
A lot of it has to do with the Southeastern Poultry Group. They have the veterinarians that get together, industry veterinarians, and they provide a good bit of research for scientists. And so you see what's on their list of what they're going to fund, and they may only fund 5 or 6 programs. And whatever that program is, you go after those funds, and hopefully you will get them.
Yes. So if you do you have like books, like do you have either like leadership or training or poultry, books that you recommend to, like when you had students? A lot of people recommend certain things. I live by this. Anything like that you would recommend to listeners?
Well, the diseases of poultry are mainly for researchers that have the money to do it. If you're just starting out, the 𝗹𝗶𝗹𝗹 has a number of small books that they're $150 or something like that. They have one for pathology, and then they have one that's diagnostic techniques, and then they have one that's just happen to do with various other things. So those would be the places to start. And if you got a grant, that you just add that to the grant. If you got a grant and you want to buy the more expensive diseases of poultry one, or you can borrow another person who was in the department if you in fact cannot afford it at the time, because the book's gotten pretty expensive. But the thing about it is you can go online now, and there's such an incredible amount of information, either coming from basic breeders, vaccine companies. There's things called SlideShare, where you actually can go there and see slideshows where professors have put together things for teaching, and you can use that for your teaching methods. So, there's a lot of information out there. So if you cannot afford the 𝗹𝗹𝗹 books for some reason or another, get this other information, and then hopefully you will be able to. I was lucky enough to have grants that every year paid for 𝗹𝗹𝗹, it paid for poultry science, it paid for all of them, right? So I got all these free journals. And when I retired, I had journals avian diseases that went back to 0. It was just like the first one that was out there, first diseases of poultry. And, I gave them to individuals that were in our department. And that, I think, should be done. Individuals that are going to retire, give the journals away. But the thing is, now the journals are online, so you don't have to do that. If you're a member of 𝗹𝗹𝗹 or poultry science, you get them all. So you in fact don't have to buy those books. But if you want an isolation determination of poultry pathogens, which is a AAAP book.
Isolation. Yes, they just
You,
redid that.
yeah, get that book, and it's not that expensive, and it's
Good
something
book.
that's helpful. Yeah, it is good. And the thing is, they keep them fairly up to date. I mean, obviously, the way things turn out, if your book's a few years old, you may need to get some additional information, but you can get that from a lot the researchers that are out there.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this afternoon, Joe. It was good to virtually see you, and hopefully we can maybe see you in person in Atlanta, IPPE, maybe in January.
Yeah, I really do. I look forward to it.
That'll be awesome. All right. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Same to you.
Thanks, Joe. Bye-bye.